The invisibility of Caleb was a garment woven from threads of superstition and revulsion, a cloak he had worn since childhood. His albinism, in the rigid and brutal hierarchy of Sweetwater, was not merely a difference, it was an omen. To the other enslaved, he was a child born under a bad sign, his pale skin and pink eyes seen as evidence of a spirit not fully settled in the world of the living. They did not shun him out of malice, but out of a deep, primal fear that his condition was contagious, a curse that could be caught by proximity. Their whispers of night walker and crawling ghost created a buffer of space around him, a lonely clearing in the crowded quarters. This isolation, while a profound emotional burden, became his first and most potent weapon. He was a spectator in plain sight, his presence noted and then immediately dismissed by eyes that refused to linger on his unsettling form. Master Everett's contempt for this violation of nature's order was even more instrumental. The master saw Caleb as a living stain on the aesthetic of his dominion, a flaw in the perceived purity of his control. Where Everett demanded clear delineations, black labor, white cotton, his own unquestioned authority, Caleb was a blur, a smudge on the ledger of creation. This profound disgust meant Everett could not bear to look at him for long, relegating him to tasks that kept him close enough to command but never truly seen, his personhood so thoroughly negated that he became a piece of furniture, a pale post to which orders could be barked. This curated blindness allowed Caleb to become the plantation's silent archivist. While others had to keep their heads down, he could observe. He saw the furtive glances exchanged between lovers planning an escape, the hidden resentment in a man's eyes as he was forced to bow, the secret kindness of a shared crust of bread. He witnessed the overseer pocketing a silver flask, a secret vice that could be leverage. He learned the rhythms of the master's rages and his rare moments of indolence. The darkest secrets of Sweetwater, the things that happened in the still of the night or in the shaded corners of the barn, were all laid bare before him because the perpetrators, from the master to the lowest overseer, acted as if he were not truly there. They spoke of punishments and profits in front of him as if he were a hound sleeping by the fire, their words unguarded and their intentions clear. This unearned, supernatural anonymity granted him a terrible education in the mechanics of cruelty and the hidden language of survival, making him the one soul on the plantation who truly understood the full, rotten architecture of the world he was trapped in, and who was therefore uniquely positioned to dismantle it from within its own blind spots. The invisibility of Caleb was a garment woven from threads of superstition and revulsion, a cloak he had worn since childhood. His albinism, in the rigid and brutal hierarchy of Sweetwater, was not merely a difference, it was an omen. To the other enslaved, he was a child born under a bad sign, his pale skin and pink eyes seen as evidence of a spirit not fully settled in the world of the living. They did not shun him out of malice, but out of a deep, primal fear that his condition was contagious, a curse that could be caught by proximity. Their whispers of night walker and crawling ghost created a buffer of space around him, a lonely clearing in the crowded quarters. This isolation, while a profound emotional burden, became his first and most potent weapon. He was a spectator in plain sight, his presence noted and then immediately dismissed by eyes that refused to linger on his unsettling form. Master Everett's contempt for this violation of nature's order was even more instrumental. The master saw Caleb as a living stain on the aesthetic of his dominion, a flaw in the perceived purity of his control. Where Everett demanded clear delineations, black labor, white cotton, his own unquestioned authority, Caleb was a blur, a smudge on the ledger of creation. This profound disgust meant Everett could not bear to look at him for long, relegating him to tasks that kept him close enough to command but never truly seen, his personhood so thoroughly negated that he became a piece of furniture, a pale post to which orders could be barked. This curated blindness allowed Caleb to become the plantation's silent archivist. While others had to keep their heads down, he could observe. He saw the furtive glances exchanged between lovers planning an escape, the hidden resentment in a man's eyes as he was forced to bow, the secret kindness of a shared crust of bread. He witnessed the overseer pocketing a silver flask, a secret vice that could be leverage. He learned the rhythms of the master's rages and his rare moments of indolence. The darkest secrets of Sweetwater, the things that happened in the still of the night or in the shaded corners of the barn, were all laid bare before him because the perpetrators, from the master to the lowest overseer, acted as if he were not truly there. They spoke of punishments and profits in front of him as if he were a hound sleeping by the fire, their words unguarded and their intentions clear. This unearned, supernatural anonymity granted him a terrible education in the mechanics of cruelty and the hidden language of survival, making him the one soul on the plantation who truly understood the full, rotten architecture of the world he was trapped in, and who was therefore uniquely positioned to dismantle it from within its own blind spots. The assignment was delivered not with a shout, but with a soft, venomous precision that made it all the more degrading. Master Everett, his eyes tracing Caleb's form with clinical disgust, fashioned the duty as a perverse form of elevation, a twisted honor for the plantation's resident specter. "You will not sweat in the dirt with the others," he had stated, his voice a low, cold thing. "A creature of your peculiarity should not sully the cotton. You will serve my tea." On the surface, in the warped logic of the estate, it was a lighter task, a removal from the back-breaking labor of the field. But Caleb, and every soul who watched from the rows, understood the true, exquisite cruelty of the command. It was a deliberate act of psychological torment, designed to isolate him completely from the very community that already feared him. He was to become a servant not just to the master, but to the master's leisure, a living prop in the daily theater of his dominance. While his mother, his cousins, and the only people who constituted a world for him bent their bodies until their spines ached, he was to walk among them, cool and unburdened, carrying the symbol of their oppressor's comfort. The weight of the heavy clay jug in his hands was nothing compared to the crushing burden of the eyes upon him. He saw the flicker of confusion, the hardening of resentment in the gaze of the men as he passed. He was a reminder of the master's arbitrary power, a walking example of how one could be singled out and made complicit. The women would sometimes look away, as if his presence was a shame they all shared. This forced proximity to Everett's power was its own unique hell. He had to stand, silent and immobile, a pale statue just a few feet from the men, close enough to hear the clink of ice in the glass, the soft, satisfied sigh after a sip, the casual, murderous comments Everett would mutter to his overseer. "That one is lagging, break his spirit," or, "She's strong, put her on the night shift." Caleb became a conduit for these death sentences, hearing the verdicts spoken into the air beside him before they were carried out on the bodies of his people. He was made to witness the immediate aftermath, the raw, bleeding stripes on a back, the collapse of exhaustion, the silent tears of despair, all while holding the very vessel that represented the system inflicting the pain. The cruelest cut was that this ritual happened under the blazing sun, in full view of everyone, cementing his role as the master's ghost, an ethereal extension of the big house sent to haunt the fields, a constant, painful reminder that no one was beyond the reach of Everett's calculated malice, and that even a ghost could be forced to serve. The discovery of his strange affliction was not a single moment of revelation but a slow, dawning horror accumulated through a lifetime of minor, inexplicable events. As a child, a fall that scraped his knee did not just leave a bloody graze, the red dirt beneath him was found the next morning bleached to a pale, dusty tan, as if the earth itself had sickened. His tears, shed in the solitude of the woods, left faint, silvery trails on his cheeks that took hours to fade and would cause a single leaf or blade of grass upon which they fell to lose its vibrant green, withering to a brittle, parchment white. He learned to weep only onto the hard-packed clay of his secret hiding places, where the evidence could be scuffed away. This power, for it could be nothing else, was a source of profound terror, a confirmation of the curses whispered about him. He was not just an outcast in appearance, his very biology was a blight. He became fastidiously careful, hiding any sign of his body's secret work. A nosebleed from a sudden blow was a catastrophe, requiring him to frantically cover the spot with soil, his heart hammering as he watched the crimson stain spread not outwards, but downwards, leaching the color from the ground in a spreading circle of ashen decay until he could bury it. He kept his hands perpetually clenched when stressed, lest a drop of sweat fall from his palm and betray him. This self-imposed quarantine was a second slavery, a prison of constant vigilance where he was the warden of his own dangerous flesh. He viewed this power not as a gift but as a monstrous corruption, a manifestation of the unnatural state everyone accused him of. It was a poison that resided within him, a force of negation that could unmake the living vibrancy of the world, and to reveal it would be to confirm every fear, every superstition, and invite not just his own destruction but likely that of his mother, who was already blamed for birthing a ghost. So, he locked it away, this terrible, silent potential, deep within the core of his being, a secret even more guarded than his own thoughts, a dormant curse that he carried with him every day, a power he feared too much to ever contemplate using, a key to a door he never dreamed of opening. The heat that day was a physical presence, a weight that made every breath a conscious effort and turned the air in the cotton rows to a thick, shimmering syrup. The woman was Sarah, her body already strained to its limit by the new life growing within her and the old life of relentless labor that sought to break her. Caleb saw her stumble, a slow, graceful collapse that was more exhaustion than fall, her hand going to the small of her back as she tried to straighten, her face a mask of pure fatigue. The overseer's shout was immediate, a guttural crack that split the humid air, but it was Master Everett, from his shaded perch, who acted. He did not shout. He rose, his movement deliberate, and took the whip himself, his face a study in cold displeasure. He saw not a struggling, pregnant woman, but an instrument of his wealth willfully slowing its function. He strode into the field, the sun glinting off the polished leather of his boots, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The first lash caught her across the shoulders, a sharp, sickening report that made Caleb flinch as if struck himself. Sarah cried out, a short, sharp sound of surprise and pain. The second lash landed lower, and she crumpled to her knees, her arms wrapping instinctively around her belly. A third strike never fell, because a dark, spreading stain bloomed suddenly against the rough fabric of her dress, and a low, guttural moan of utter despair escaped her lips as she understood what was happening. The field, which had been a chorus of rustling leaves and labored breathing, fell into a silence so profound that the buzz of a fly sounded like a scream. In that silence, something in Caleb, something that had been bending for years, finally and irrevocably snapped. The cold, passive fury that had been his constant companion did not boil over, instead, it crystallized into a single, diamond-sharp point of purpose. The sight of Sarah, huddled and broken on the ground, her future stolen in a moment of casual brutality, severed the last tether of his fear. The terror of his own secret power was suddenly dwarfed by the overwhelming, righteous need for an answer to the atrocity unfolding before him. The master's obsession with purity, with order, with the stark whiteness of his cotton, became the focal point of Caleb's new, chilling resolve. It was no longer enough to be a ghost, a silent witness. The invisible man would now become an active, vengeful force. The master's world, built on the color of his wealth, would be answered with a whiteness far more terrifying and absolute than he could ever imagine. The silence that followed Sarah's loss was not empty, it was a vessel waiting to be filled, and Caleb filled it with a vow that was not spoken aloud but etched into the very substance of his being. He did not look to the heavens, for he had long believed God had no eyes for a place like Sweetwater. Instead, he looked down, past the dusty tops of his bare feet, into the very soil of Mississippi itself, the same soil that drank the sweat of his people and, too often, their blood. It was to this ancient, witnessing earth that he made his pact. He offered the only thing he truly owned, his life, his strange and cursed essence, the very power he had spent a lifetime hiding in shame. In the deep, quiet center of his soul, he bartered his own vitality, his future, his very spirit, in exchange for a terrible and specific justice. He was no longer merely a man, or even a ghost, he was now a petitioner before a dark and hungry altar, and his offering was himself. This was not a plea for strength or for escape, but for a transaction of cosmic retribution. He would become the instrument, and the land, with its long memory of pain, would provide the means. He would channel his blight, his unnatural whiteness, not as a passive accident, but as a focused weapon, turning the master's own vile obsession against him. The power that leached color and life would now be deliberately unleashed, not as a secret shame, but as a chosen curse. It was a surrender of his last vestiges of hope for a normal existence, an acceptance that his destiny was indeed intertwined with the supernatural, not as a victim, but as an agent of a reckoning that the laws of man could never provide. In that moment, he felt a shift, not in the air, but in the ground beneath him, a subtle resonance as if the land itself had heard and accepted his grim offering. The weight of the clay jug in his hand was no longer a symbol of his servitude, it felt like a ceremonial vessel, a crucible for the poison he now willingly pledged to brew. The path before him was clear, cold, and irreversible, lit not by hope, but by the cold, phosphorescent light of a vengeance that would be as slow, deliberate, and inescapable as the growing of the cotton itself. The transition from passive vessel to active poisoner was a chillingly simple one, a quiet perversion of his daily ritual that filled the mundane act with a sacrilegious gravity. The journey to the well, once a walk of shame, became a procession of grim purpose. As he lowered the bucket into the cool, dark depths, he was no longer drawing water, but priming a weapon. The heavy clay jug, slick with condensation, became an altar upon which he would make his daily sacrifice. His first act was always one of deliberate, controlled violence against himself. Using a sharp sliver of flint he kept hidden in the seam of his ragged trousers, he would press the point into the pad of his thumb or the pale flesh of his forearm, not in a frantic slash, but with a slow, steady pressure that ensured a reliable, welling flow. He would watch, his heart a cold, still stone in his chest, as the dark droplet, thick with his unnatural essence, fell into the clear water. It would hang for a moment in the depths, a tiny black star in a liquid sky, before dissolving, leaving no trace but a faint, coppery tang that was quickly swallowed by the scent of mint and molasses-sweetened tea. This was the most dangerous moment, the act of creation, and he performed it with the focus of a scribe illuminating a forbidden text. He then had to walk back, the now tainted jug in his hands, a vessel of slow death masquerading as refreshment. Every step was measured, his eyes cast down not in submission but to conceal the terrifying knowledge he carried. He had to present the jug to the master with the same silent, empty deference as always, his face a mask of blank obedience while inside, he willed the hidden corruption to do its work. He would stand, a statue of servitude, and watch as Everett, his lips curling in a faint smile of satisfaction, raised the glass to his mouth. Each sip the master took was a silent victory, a communion of a different kind, where the blood of the enslaved was willingly, if unknowingly, consumed by the master, a perverse inversion of the natural order that was as profound as it was invisible. The field, the sun, the rustling cotton, the entire world was an unwitting witness to this intimate, daily act of assassination, where the poison was not some exotic herb, but the very life force of the ghost he had created. The change in Master Everett was not the dramatic fever sweat of a common ague but a slow, insidious leaching, as if the very pigment of his being was being drawn out drop by drop. It began with a pallor that was noticed not in a single day, but in a creeping realization over weeks. The robust, sun-reddened hue of his complexion, a mark of his time spent surveying his domain, began to fade, surrendering to a waxen, sallow tone. He took to complaining of a perpetual chill, even as the Mississippi sun beat down, and would sometimes be seen drawing a light coat about his shoulders in the middle of the afternoon. His famed vigor, the energy that allowed him to stride the length of the fields and back without a hint of fatigue, began to abandon him. He remained in his viewing chair for longer periods, his movements becoming languid and heavy, as if he were moving through water. A subtle, persistent tremor took up residence in his hands, a faint vibration that caused the ice in his tea glass to clink with a nervous, constant rhythm. This physical decline was shadowed by a corrosion of his spirit. The men who had ruled with cold, calculated certainty became prey to a gnawing paranoia. He saw sullen defiance in every bowed head, heard whispered conspiracies in the rustle of the cotton plants. His temper, once a predictable and controlled instrument of terror, became brittle and erratic, flaring at minor infractions and then just as quickly sputtering out, leaving him listless and confused. He began to scrutinize his food and drink with a new, suspicious eye, though his gaze always passed over the silent, pale servant who provided it. Doctors were summoned from town, who bled him and prescribed tonics, but their remedies only seemed to accelerate his decline. They spoke of miasmas and imbalances of the humors, utterly baffled by a sickness that seemed to stem from no wound or contagion they could identify. It was a consumption of the soul, a withering from the inside out, and as he weakened, his eyes took on a haunted, frantic look, as if he could sense an invisible adversary clinging to him, draining him not of blood, but of essence, leaving behind a shell that was growing paler and more hollow with each passing day, a living portrait of the bleached and bloodless world he had created. The field itself began to testify against him. It started in a single, contained area, a circle of earth directly surrounding the spot where Master Everett's chair was placed and where, daily, the dregs of his tainted tea were tossed onto the soil. At first, it was a subtle paling, a loss of the rich, vibrant green that characterized the healthy cotton plants, fading to a sickly lime color that was barely noticeable unless one was looking for it. But as the master's vitality continued to seep away, the affliction in the plants grew more pronounced and horrifyingly literal. The leaves, once broad and green, began to curl at the edges, becoming brittle and taking on the stark, papery white of a sun-bleached bone. The change crept down the stalks and spread outwards in a silent, creeping wave, creating a ghastly halo of death around the seat of power. The cotton bolls themselves, the very source of Everett's wealth and pride, were the most damning. Instead of bursting with their fluffy, off-white harvest, they seemed to shrink and desiccate, their fibers matting together into tight, hard clumps of a pure, shocking white, a white so absolute it seemed to swallow the light, a color that spoke not of purity but of void and extinction. This was not the fertile white of the harvest, it was the white of a grave shroud, of bone meal, of ash. The enslaved workers, with their deep, practical understanding of the land, gave the patch a wide berth, their superstitious fears of Caleb now grafted onto the very earth he had poisoned. They whispered that the land was rejecting the master, that it was sick with his evil. The overseer, a practical man of violence, saw only blight and ruin, and his confusion fed Everett's growing terror. The master would stand at the edge of this expanding ring of blanched death, his own face a mirror of its pallor, staring at the bleached plants as if they were a personal, malevolent omen. The field, which had always been a testament to his control, had become a canvas displaying his affliction for all to see, a visible, spreading stain of the invisible curse that was consuming him, proving that the poison was not just in his body, but had seeped into the foundation of his world, tainting the very symbol of his power and turning it into a monument of his impending end. The sight of the bleached and withered cotton, a grotesque mockery of the wealth it was supposed to represent, finally snapped the last vestiges of Master Everett's rationality. Paranoia and physical decay had hollowed him out, but a final, desperate surge of rage propelled him from his chair one afternoon, his movements stiff and jerky like a marionette controlled by a furious hand. He staggered into the field, his boots crunching on the brittle, white stalks, his eyes wild and fixed not on the plants, but on Caleb, who stood silently at the edge of the blighted circle, holding the now empty water jug. The field hands froze, the very air itself seeming to solidify around this confrontation they had all felt brewing in the oppressive heat. Everett's voice, once a tool of command, was a ragged, breathless thing as he advanced, pointing a trembling, skeletal finger at Caleb. "You," he rasped, the word a dry rattle. "It is you." The pieces of his ruin finally clicked into place in his fevered mind, the pale servant, the strange sickness, the cursed land surrounding his seat of power. He saw now that the ghost he had created was not merely an oddity but an active, malevolent force. He stumbled to a halt before Caleb, his body shaking with a mixture of fury and profound weakness, his face a mask of terrified recognition. He was no longer confronting a slave, he was facing the architect of his demise, the source of the invisible poison that had been leaching the life and color from his world. In that moment, the carefully maintained hierarchy of Sweetwater evaporated. It was no longer master and slave, but victim and executioner, a man staring into the cold, pink eyes of the vengeance he had so carelessly cultivated. The truth, stark and undeniable, passed between them in the silence, and Everett understood that the horror was not some random plague or bad luck, but a deliberate, calculated retribution delivered by the one person he had believed to be utterly beneath his notice, a weapon he had himself sharpened through years of contempt and cruelty. The confrontation reached its terrible, silent climax not with a scream, but with a profound and chilling stillness. As Master Everett stood before him, his body trembling with the awful realization of his fate, Caleb finally allowed the last barriers around his secret to fall. He did not move, he did not speak, but a change came over him, a final, absolute surrender to the power he had bargained with. He let the last of his own life force, the cursed essence he had so long contained, flow outwards not in a trickle, but in a single, focused wave. The air around them grew cold and sharp, and the bleached plants at their feet seemed to hum with a silent energy. Everett's eyes widened in a final, wordless plea as he felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather seize him from the inside out. It was a sensation of absolute draining, a swift and merciless leaching of all warmth, all color, all vitality. His skin, already pale, began to take on the stark, pure white of the cursed cotton, losing all texture and tone, becoming a smooth, featureless surface. The tremor in his hands stilled, frozen in place. His fine linen suit, the very symbol of his status, seemed to fuse with his petrifying skin, the fabric itself bleaching to the same deathly white. The process was horrifyingly swift, a statue being carved by an invisible, vengeful hand. Within moments, where Master Everett had stood, there was only a rigid, colorless effigy, his face locked in a final rictus of terror and understanding, his arms contorted in a last, feeble gesture of defense. He was a hollow monument, a man made perfectly, utterly white, his form as brittle and bloodless as the stalks of the field he had prized above human life. Caleb, the last of his strength spent, looked upon his work. The vengeance was complete, a justice as absolute and terrifying as the power that had delivered it. The master had not been conquered, he had been consumed by the very whiteness he had worshipped, transformed into a permanent, silent fixture in the blighted landscape of his own ruin, a stark and warning shade amidst the field of bone-white cotton.